Hello, Brobs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide, Dorothy Bloch. We continue with the chapter A Dog That Didn't Deserve to Be a Child. I've never seen such a good dog, the owner marveled, and smart. You only have to tell her something once and she knows. Priscilla performed all the good traditional acts of good dogs. She brought me my slippers and my newspaper and snuggled quietly at my feet while I read. Gradually, more and more time was given over to the good owner, the scene with the bad owner dwindling into merely a point of departure for the sale and then disappearing altogether. The entire session was now devoted to the idyllic relationship of a dog that wanted only to please and an owner whose response was to reward. The contents underwent constant elaboration. My adult consultation room became a pet shop where each time we purchased new clothing for Priscilla. From there, we progressed to the waiting room, which became a license bureau, each time following the acquisition of a new wardrobe, which always included a collar and a leash. We applied at the bureau and received a license and proof of ownership. We then returned home, where Priscilla feasted on a fine steak and very special dog biscuits. After many repetitions, the inevitable change was introduced. I don't listen to you, and I run away, and I have an accident, and I'm brought home wounded, and you call the doctor, was the first version of the new departure. After one or two tryouts, this was amended to, I get hurt because I saved somebody's life crossing the street. This then became, I saved 5 people's lives, and the newspapers call you to find out about it. When the telephone rang, I answered with great pride. Yes, she did it all by herself. Yes, she's a very brave dog. No, I never have any trouble with her. She does everything right. They ask about a reward, interposed Patty. A reward? I asked the reporter. I certainly agree that she deserves one. You'll see about it? Well, thank you. Just let me know. After a rerun, Patty had a further inspiration. I saved the whole city, she announced, and the mayor hears about it. And there's a reward, and he gives it to me himself. And the newspapers keep telephoning. While Priscilla lay recovering from her wounds in a state of transcendent bliss, I was kept busy dealing with the reporters in the mayor's office. Gradually, plans for an awards ceremony developed in which the mayor himself would make the presentation. This prospect apparently presented a serious challenge to Patty's fantasy. I can talk, she informed me one day. You have magic powers, and you make me talk. Accompanying my incantations with the traditional mystical gestures, I cried, Abracadabra, cadabra, kadum, you can talk. From then on, this ritual started each session. The barking disappeared, and Priscilla was free to talk to the reporters herself and to respond to the mayor. She decided that the most appropriate place for the entire scene was the top of the large playroom desk. This gave the photographers an excellent vantage point for their picture taking. Holding both my hands high over my head, I opened and closed them in a clicking motion, running around the desk in what appeared to be a thoroughly acceptable simulation of camera action as far as Patty was concerned. The height of the desk, however, also suggested other possibilities and a further extension of Priscilla's powers. Priscilla can dance, Patty stated one day. She's a ballet dancer, and the program of the awards ceremony was amended to include this extraordinary feature. At this point, countless gifts began to arrive from all parts of the country, and considerable time was devoted to the construction of warehouses large enough to accommodate them. Patty now seemed ready to end the fantasy. You marry the president and we move to the White House, she announced happily at the close of one session, with an implied and they lived happily ever after feeling. When she returned after another summer, she had apparently abandoned the fantasy and now briefly became absorbed in the problems of her actual relationships with parents and friends. She missed 1 month of treatment in the late fall, however, and when she resumed, still somewhat irregularly, her unkempt hair and artificial voice betrayed a partial state of regression. As she was leaving, she commented, It's a long time since we talked about Tiger and Priscilla. At her next session, she immediately asked, Can we play the dog game? The fantasy was resumed, but with an altered cast and a completely different theme. The bad owner was reintroduced with the name of Meaninda, Several variations in which Priscilla was lost or abandoned in a basket outside my door were tried out, followed by other variations in which Meaninda first informed me that I could keep her dog if I found her, and then, in a change of mind, attempted to buy her back. I was directed to conceal from Meaninda that Priscilla had the power of speech, and to conduct the entire negotiation myself. The session usually started with my finding Priscilla. What is this? I exclaimed in delighted surprise as I discovered the basket on my doorstep. What a beautiful dog. And right on my doorstep, I can't imagine who would want to leave such a lovely creature. You come right in here where it's warm and comfortable, and I'll see about getting you some food. Thank you, said Priscilla. Why, you can talk, I exclaimed in amazement. Yes, I have the power of speech, Priscilla stated modestly. Priscilla was always fed and then, under my prompting, launched into her complaints about her owner. Now tell me what happened, was the usual opener, which was inevitably followed by a sad tale of mistreatment and cruelty. But why is she so mean, I asked. What makes her so wicked? She's a witch, replied Patty with passion, because her mother was a witch, and now she's trying to do the same thing to me. Following this introduction, there was a knock at the door, and Meaninda entered and engaged in casual conversation. At first she disparaged Priscilla, then expressed a rather ambivalent feeling of wanting her back, and finally offered to purchase her. At the mere mention of such a possibility, frightened barks were heard from Priscilla. She became extremely agitated and directed me to put Meaninda out. How dare you raise such a question? I demanded. Can't you see how upsetting it is to Priscilla? Don't ever mention such a subject again. I wouldn't part with Priscilla for all the money in the world, and now you'll have to go. I can't allow anyone to disturb Priscilla in this way. This version of the fantasy lasted several months and eventually became the game of jailing the witch. And with the intervention of another summer, it was finally abandoned. That it could not be resolved was indicated by Patty's inability to achieve the status of a child throughout its duration. Although the dog that didn't deserve to be a child was permitted to evolve into an exemplary creature on whom the power of speech was repeatedly conferred and who was also permitted to dance, at no point did she become human. Patty's only solution to the persistent danger of her threatening environment and of her mother's uncompromising character of a witch was to move in with me. The fantasy of living with me, which frequently develops in response to the child's needs for refuge, is usually abandoned as the child's health returns and the parental environment improves. In Patty's case, the lack of any real change in her parents gave rise to a curious development about whose complete significance I can only speculate. Patty returned from her vacation with a persistent rage at me that was mainly expressed in silence. Although I did not have ample opportunity to explore it, I have the impression that with her improved sense of reality, her recognition of my limited role in her life resulted in a feeling of betrayal. As in other rare instances where the parents remain unchanged, I can only guess that Patty turned her rage against me for having been a party to a fantasy, which, although it had led her to improved health, remained unresolved and incapable of realization. It was also a measure of the success of her treatment that she reached the stage of a negative transference. Had her parents supported her analysis and allowed her to remain, Patty would have had an opportunity to vent her rage and to establish on a verbal level what she had achieved in fantasy. As it is, with the development of her negative feelings, they terminated her sessions. The fantasy that led Patty from schizophrenia into the world of reality progressed through three different phases and a coda, each one representing a step toward health and marked by evolving identities for both of us. When she initially delineated me as a blur, an angel who can turn bad people into good, she presented her central preoccupation with feelings of worthlessness and the ephemeral hope epitomized by the substantiality of her drawing, and I possessed supernatural powers that could transform her and so make her eligible for love. The first identity she assumed reinforced the impression she was a clown, surely the lowliest creature with a name that had no reference to anything human and no clearly defined sex. It took no more than my acceptance of her fantasy, however, for her to conjure up a lion on my terrace, and in response to my further acceptance, my expression of mild alarm, to advance to the role of animal trainer, who proceeded not only to reveal the terror of her inner world, but to protect me from it. It was evident from the very first session that Patty's greatest need was approval. My unstinting praise and admiration were called forth by the structure of her fantasy and marked the first phase of her treatment. From my appreciation of the ease with which she controlled her monsters, to my enthusiastic applause of her various circus roles, to my proclamation of her virtues, I simply picked up her cues in a spiraling expression of need and response. Throughout this period of unalloyed praise, when Patty was essentially a performer of extraordinary merit and had no particular identity herself, she left me pretty much to my own devices and never defined my identity either. The second phase of Patty's fantasy was foreshadowed by a transitional period that ended with her designation, for the first time, of a role for herself that allowed her to confront and express her unbearable feelings. It was not until her unconditional acceptance of me following her fantasied escape forever from parents who had twice attempted to blow her up that, as the dog that didn't deserve to be a child, she finally permitted herself to adopt a role in which she was unqualifiedly bad. At the same time, she assigned me a role that enabled her to explore and to evaluate her relationship to her mother, and finally to modify to a large degree the horrible self-image that defended her against her mother's hatred. The first intimation that I was being informed or being transformed into a Simon Legree, and that she was also evolving into something other than a magnificent performer, came in relation to the training of Wonder Dog. As she allowed herself to experience her badness to the full, she apparently also began to question the validity not only of this concept of herself, but of her concept of the virtue of her owner. This slowly led to the reversal of roles, and finally, as her new need asserted itself, to the third stage, the gradual abandonment of the enactment of viciousness and hatred, and the institution of a joyous era where virtue was rewarded and love reigned supreme. Although I was frequently in the dark, particularly during the early period, about where Patty's fantasy was leading, the positive changes in her personality and her relationship to reality were always reassuring. After about 1 year, her creativity burst forth with a flurry of drawings that gradually led her to painting, music, and dancing, all of which continued during the rest of her treatment. The classmates who had previously ostracized her began to admire her, and their recognition and acceptance further motivated her tolerance of the realistic demands of the school situation. Her bizarre and seemingly myopic manner of reading, her strange way of slapping her feet when she walked, and the curiously artificial pitch of her voice all disappeared. She now sought and received approval. Slapping her feet, when she walked. As the code of the Patty's fantasy indicated, the one element that remained relatively unchanged was the feeling her parents communicated and her response to them. Their attempt to withdraw her from treatment was reenacted in the thinly veiled fantasy in which I defeat Meninda's efforts to buy her back. Patty's clearest statement about her mother was expressed in that connection. She's a witch because her mother was a witch, and now she's trying to do the same thing to me. Although her fantasy contains only one reference to her father, it is quite evident that she imputed to him the same murderous intention toward her that she ascribed to her mother. The twice repeated attempt to blow her up. He is also one of the two mean owners who gave her either food without water or water without food and treated her inhumanly. Patty's all-absorbing preoccupation with feeling of worthlessness not only reflected the intensity of her parents' hostile feelings in the absence of their love, but also served as a defense against her terror of being killed. We can measure the magnitude of that terror by the fact that Patty required the symptomatology of schizophrenia in order to deal with it. Her murderous response to her parents' murderous feelings was so intolerable to her that she had to wipe out all sense of her own identity and project her overwhelming rage onto monsters whom she could control. I mean, could you really qualify that as schizophrenia? Although she was finally able to express those feelings, her ability to do so only in fantasy suggests that the terror of her real world remained too threatening for her to confront directly. Transparent as her references to it were, she was some distance from being able to acknowledge the smallest part of what she conveyed in fantasy. Unlike Ellie, who moved quickly from "I don't like to think of myself as a giraffe" to "Do you think I'm a monster?" and then to her fear of being killed, which she dealt with first in fantasy, and then indirect confrontation, Patty allowed her terror to surface only occasionally and only within the framework of her fantasy. We can trace Ellie's ability to discard her unbearable self images and then to work through her monster fantasies until she could abandon it and verbalize her terror directly to both her increased ego strength and the improved conditions of her objective reality. My efforts to make Ellie's responses understandable to her parents and to modify their manner of dealing with her had met with some success, particularly with her mother, whose depression had also decreased. Her mother's genuine appreciation and understanding of Ellie, as well as her father's willingness to leave this discipline to his wife, were important factors leading to Ellie's improved health. I had no such success with Patty's parents, even though psychoanalytic treatment had enabled Patty to emerge from schizophrenia through her use of fantasy. The unyielding character of her parents' hostility and their inability to meet Patty's need for love required a continuing defense that restricted to fantasy the expression of her perceptions of their feelings and of her response to them and prevented it from being resolved. Her treatment was terminated at a point where her rage was becoming available to her. This lady gives herself a lot of credit. We shall return next time with the inhibition of fantasy and the predisposition to kill, which ought to be remarkable. Goodbye, Ralph. Goodbye.